The lawyer laughed. Not quietly, not to himself. He laughed in a room with 11 other people in it. Bank representatives, pipeline surveyors, 2 county officials, a court reporter, and one 68-year-old man in a clean flannel shirt sitting alone on the opposite side of a long table. The lawyer's name was Mitchell Crane. He was 46 years old. He held the deed at arm's length by one corner, the way a person holds something they do not wish to touch. The deed was old. The paper was thick and soft with age, and the edges were stained brown. Not from water, not from carelessness, but from decades spent inside a steel tube buried 2 feet below the frost line in a field in eastern Nebraska. Dirt had worked into the paper's grain over the years and stayed there. It looked like something recovered from the earth, which it was. Mitchell Crane held it up so the room could see it. He said, "This is what we're dealing with." 2 of the bank's representatives smiled. One of the surveyors looked at the ceiling. The man in the flannel shirt looked at Mitchell Crane and did not change his expression. His name was Leonard Dale Speck. He had spent 44 years building what that deed described. He had not driven 91 miles to watch a lawyer hold his father's document like a joke. He said nothing. He had learned long before that room that silence was the most accurate thing a man could say. Leonard Speck was 68 years old. He farmed 412 acres in Antelope County, Nebraska, in the northeastern corner of the state where the land runs flat and the sky is very large, and the nearest city of any size is 54 miles east. He had lived on this land continuously since 1984. He had worked someone else's land for 9 years before that. Hired hand, then equipment operator, then supervisor, saving every dollar he did not need to survive. He had no family money. His father, Dale Speck, had rented his whole life. 320 acres of bottom ground in Holt County, rented from the same family for 31 years. Farming land he would never own, handing over a check every March that represented the best of what the previous year had produced. Dale Speck never complained about it, but Leonard watched. He watched every March. He decided something the year he turned 19, standing in the kitchen of a rented farmhouse while his father wrote a check to someone who had not touched that soil once in the last decade. He decided he would own his ground, whatever it took, however long it took. It took 9 years. He bought the first 160 acres in 1984 for $187,000, every cent of his savings plus a production loan he paid off in 6 years. He bought the eastern 120 acres in 1991 for $134,000. He bought the southern parcel, the creek pasture, 132 acres, in 1997 for $148,000. 412 acres, paid off in full by 2003. Every deed filed, every survey recorded. The creek pasture was the one that mattered now. Leonard had bought it from a man named Arthur Gaines. Arthur Gaines was 79 years old in 1997, farmed alone, had no children, and had been working that 132-acre parcel since 1951. He had an attachment to it that went beyond property. His wife was buried on the high ground above the creek. He had told Leonard this the first time Leonard had come to look at the land, standing at the fence line in early spring. He said, "I'll sell it to you, but I want something in writing." Leonard said, "Name it." Arthur said, "That pasture runs along Willow Branch Creek. There are springs that come up in the northwest corner. Have since before I was here. They feed the creek and the creek feeds the wetland on the south end. I want a covenant on this deed that says that water stays in the ground. Nobody runs pipe through it. Nobody drains it. Nobody touches those springs. Ever." Leonard said, "Done." They drew up the covenant that same week. A lawyer in Neely drafted it. 4 paragraphs, attached to the deed, recorded with the Antelope County Register of Deeds on March 14, 1997. The covenant restricted any subsurface disturbance within 600 feet of the documented spring locations in the northwest corner of the parcel. It applied to all future owners. It ran with the land. It had no expiration. Arthur Gaines died in 2004. His wife was still on the high ground above the creek. The springs still came up in the northwest corner every spring, the same as they had since before anyone had written anything down about them. Leonard buried the deed, both pages, the covenant and the property description, inside a sealed steel tube and placed it 2 feet below grade in the field margin along the northwest fence line. He had a second copy in his filing cabinet at home, but Arthur Gaines had told him the day they signed that a document kept only inside is a document at risk. He said, "Put one somewhere they can't get to it without digging." Leonard had thought about that for a long time before he understood what Arthur meant. The company was called Meridian Corridor Energy Partners, LLC. They had been incorporated 14 months before they filed their pipeline right-of-way applications in Antelope County. Their primary financial backer was a commercial lending division of a regional bank headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska. The bank had committed $340 million to the pipeline project across 4 counties. The project required acquiring easements from 67 landowners. By the time they reached Leonard Speck's property, they had acquired 61 of the 67. The man they sent to Leonard's door was named Garrett Poole. He was 38 years old. He was Meridian's director of land acquisition. He had acquired 312 easements in 9 states over the previous 6 years. He drove a black SUV and carried a briefcase and wore a company fleece vest with the Meridian logo on the chest. He offered Leonard $48,000 for a permanent pipeline easement across the creek pasture, including the northwest corner. Leonard said, "No." Garrett Poole raised the offer to $71,000, then $94,000, then $118,000. Each time, Leonard said no. He did not explain why. He said no the way a man says no when the answer is not about the number. Garrett Poole went back to Omaha. Mitchell Crane, the bank's outside counsel on the project, filed an eminent domain petition with the Antelope County District Court 3 weeks later, arguing that the pipeline was a common carrier under Nebraska statute and therefore eligible for condemnation authority. Leonard called a lawyer named Susan Halverson the same afternoon he was served with the petition. Susan Halverson was 57 years old and had practiced property and agricultural law in Antelope County for 29 years. She had handled 6 eminent domain cases. She had won 4 of them. When Leonard told her about the covenant, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "Leonard, you recorded that covenant in 1997? He said, "March 14th. She said, "And the pipeline route runs through the northwest corner?" He said, "Right through the middle of the Springfield." Another pause. She said, "I need to see the deed." He said, "I'll bring you both copies." The cardboard tube was where he had put it. He had marked the location on a hand-drawn map kept in his filing cabinet. Distance from the northwest fence post, distance from the corner marker, depth. He drove the tractor out on a Thursday afternoon in November. The ground was hard but not frozen. He dug 26 inches down by hand, which took longer than he expected. His knees were not what they had been. His lower back reminded him of things he preferred not to think about. He found the tube exactly where the map said it was. He pulled it out of the ground and stood in the field holding it. The tube was sealed and intact. The dirt on the outside of it was the same color as the field, the dark, particular soil of Antelope County, which holds water well and gives back what you put into it if you treat it correctly. He drove to Susan Halverson's office. He did not open the tube until he was sitting across from her desk. The deed came out in one piece, both pages. The covenant was fully legible. The spring locations were described in the covenant's second paragraph by reference to a survey conducted in 1994 and recorded with the county, a survey that had been commissioned by Arthur Gaines and that placed the springs within the 600-foot protection radius with a precision that left no interpretive room. Susan Halverson read it twice. She pulled up the county's recorded survey on her computer and compared the coordinates against the pipeline's filed route. She said, "They need to cross within 180 feet of the nearest spring to make the route work." Leonard said, "I know." She said, "The covenant prohibits subsurface disturbance within 600 feet. This isn't an easement negotiation. This isn't eminent domain. They cannot legally run this pipeline through that corner regardless of condemnation authority, because the covenant restricts the use of the land independent of ownership. Even if a court awarded them the easement, the covenant would prohibit the physical action." Leonard said, "Arthur Gaines understood that." Susan Halverson set the deed down. She said, "Leonard, I need to tell you something. I've been doing this for 29 years. I have not seen a covenant drafted this cleanly by a small-town lawyer in 1997 that could do exactly this much work in 2023. Whoever drew this up, they knew what they were doing. Leonard said, his name was Roy Beckwith. He practiced in Neely for 40 years. He retired in 2001. She said, find out if Roy Beckwith is still alive. I'd like to shake his hand. The mediation session was held in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building in Norfolk, Nebraska on January 19, 2023. The room had a long table, institutional carpet, and windows that faced north into a gray January sky. There were 11 people on Meridian's side. There was Leonard Speck and Susan Halverson on his. Mitchell Crane arrived first. He had reviewed the deed the previous week, a copy Susan Halverson had filed with her response to the eminent domain petition. His review had taken by his billing records 3.4 hours. In those 3.4 hours, he had identified what Susan Halverson had identified in 40 minutes, which was that the covenant was valid, recorded, enforceable, and directly obstructive to the pipeline's approved route. He had spent the remaining time looking for a way around it. He had not found one. He opened the mediation by holding up the deed, the original dirt-stained, retrieved from a field, and making the remark he made, the laugh, the look toward the bank's representatives, the surveyor and the ceiling. Leonard said nothing. Susan Halverson placed 3 documents on the table, the deed and covenant, the 1994 survey certified by the county, and a routing analysis commissioned by a civil engineer she had hired the previous month. A 14-page report documenting with technical precision that the pipeline's filed route could not be executed without subsurface disturbance within the covenant's protected radius, and that no alternative micro-route existed within the acquired right-of-way that would avoid the restriction. She said, the covenant runs with the land. It cannot be condemned. It cannot be waived without the consent of all parties to the original agreement, one of whom is deceased. The pipeline, as filed and approved, cannot be built. Mitchell Crane said, we would contest the enforceability of... Susan Halverson said, you can contest it in district court. That will take between 18 and 26 months. The bank's financing commitment expires in 14 months. The pipeline requires this route. There is no approved alternative. The mediator, a retired judge named Howard Callum, 67 years old, 24 years on the bench before retirement, looked at Mitchell Crane. He said, Mr. Crane, do you have a routing alternative to present? Mitchell Crane said nothing for 7 seconds. He said, we would need additional time to assess. Howard Callum said, Mr. Crane. Another pause. Mitchell Crane said, no, we do not have an alternative route. The room was still for a long time after that. The terms were Leonard's, all of them. Meridian withdrew the eminent domain petition with prejudice, meaning they could not refile it. The pipeline route was formally abandoned and returned to the county for record. Meridian paid Leonard $287,000 in settlement, not for the easement, which they were not getting, but for legal costs, crop disruption, and documented damages from the 14-month dispute. The springs in the northwest corner of the creek pasture remained untouched. The covenant remained in force, permanently, for every owner of that land after Leonard. Arthur Gaines's wife remained on the high ground above the creek. The pipeline was never built. Leonard drove home alone. He did not stop in town. He called his daughter Ruth from the truck and told her it was over. She asked how he was. He said he was fine. He said he would explain everything that weekend. Ruth drove up from Lincoln that Saturday with her husband and their 2 children. On Sunday morning early, while the frost was still on the grass, Leonard and Ruth walked the creek pasture together. The 2 of them. No one else. They walked the whole perimeter, the east fence, the south end where the wetland goes dark in winter, the high ground above the creek where the land rises slightly before it drops back toward the water. They walked without talking much. The children were back at the house with Ruth's husband. At the northwest corner, Leonard stopped. They stood at the fence line. 30 feet away, the first spring came up through the ground in a small, dark circle, the water moving slightly even in January the way spring water does, always a few degrees warmer than the air above it, always moving, always finding its way to where it needs to go. Leonard looked at it for a while. Ruth said, he knew, didn't he? She meant Arthur Gaines. Leonard said, "He knew." They stood there a while longer. Then they walked back. There is a kind of knowledge that cannot be acquired quickly. It does not come from a course or a credential. It comes from watching the same land through enough seasons to understand that most threats are slow, and most defenses have to be built before the threat arrives. Arthur Gaines understood that in 1997, in a lawyer's office in a small Nebraska town, when he was 79 years old and selling land he had farmed for 46 years. He did not know the name of the pipeline company. He did not know the year. He knew the springs. He knew what they were worth. He knew that paper, recorded correctly and buried carefully, outlasts almost everything that tries to move against it. Tell me in the comments, if you had been Leonard, would you have taken the $118,000 and signed the easement, or held the line the way he did? I'll see you in the next one. Paste your script.